Russia's endless, messy war is dragging China down with it, and Beijing is losing patience. For Xi Jinping, Russia is looking less like a useful ally and more like a stumbling, ungrateful liability. Worse yet, China is starting to eye some of Russia's own territory, sharpening the knives for its back, while Russia is distracted in Ukraine. Xi's message to Putin is clear: get out of Ukraine, or else. And this isn't just about Ukraine. Russia has been pushing China's buttons for centuries. From stealing land in the 19th century to constant power plays, the relationship has always been shaky. To understand how deep this tension runs, let's take a closer look at their long, bumpy history. After World War II, China underwent major cultural and industrial changes, positioning itself as the Soviet Union's unofficial second-in-command in the communist world. At the time, the Soviet Union, one of the world's largest economies, provided China with essential resources, weapons, and military equipment, but their alliance was never smooth. When Stalin died, Mao Zedong expected China to take over leadership in the communist bloc. Instead, China remained second fiddle to the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. That power struggle still lingering today. Ironically, the US played a pivotal role in normalizing relations between China and the Soviet Union. With tensions still rising between the two, China saw the US, the enemy of its enemy, as a potential ally. This set the stage for an uneasy triangle where the Soviet Union, China, and the US each influenced the other's policies. Fast forward to the post-Soviet era. Russia, now the Russian Federation, sought to mend its relationship with China as both countries began to view the US as a growing geopolitical threat. This is the backdrop to today's so-called limitless alliance, an alliance built more on shared enemies than genuine friendship. For the last decade, this bond has deepened, thanks to the steady leadership of Putin and Xi, both working together to counterbalance US influence. But the cracks have always been there. China hasn't forgotten Russia's past betrayals, and Russia still views China with caution. And those cracks? They first became obvious during the Cold War, when a rivalry between supposed allies almost pushed them to the brink. But the bad blood between China and Russia stretches back much further than the Cold War. To see just how deep this rivalry runs, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, when Russia was snatching land from China's grasp. While other imperial powers returned Chinese territory after the Opium Wars, Russia held on tight to what it grabbed, and China has never forgotten it. As part of the so-called unequal treaties, Russia claimed Outer Manchuria, a chunk of land that effectively blocks China from the Sea of Japan and gives Russia a strategic foothold in the region. This sparsely populated land might not seem like much, but its loss still stings. And it's not just about the land, it's about the rivers. The border between China and Russia, drawn along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, remains a constant source of friction. China believes these rivers should be shared, while Russia insists on controlling them outright, including the lucrative shipping routes they offer. Tensions boiled over in 1969 when the Soviet Union and China fought a bloody battle over Damansky Island, or Zhenbao as the Chinese call it. Hundreds died, but Russia claimed victory, a victory that still leaves a bitter taste in China's mouth. One particularly contentious spot is Bolshoi Orozyski Island, Haixiazi. Strategically located at the confluence of the two rivers, this 130-square-mile island could be a key port for maritime transport. If China ever takes full control, it would put Russian territory and the major city of Khabarovsk right within striking distance. Russia knows how dangerous this is, which is why it's been desperate to hold on to it. And while the 2004 treaty gave China half the island, it's clear that's not enough for Beijing. In 2023, China released maps showing the whole island as Chinese territory, signaling that Xi Jinping hasn't let go of these territorial ambitions. Russia might have its hands full with Ukraine right now, but China is quietly sharpening its claws, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what it sees as rightfully theirs. And it's not just about a few disputed islands. Siberia and the Russian Far East, brimming with resources, are the real prize. But Russia's problems are even closer to home. Take Bolshoi Orozyski Island, for example. While still largely undeveloped, its location makes it a highly strategic prize for both China and Russia. For Russia, the problem is painfully obvious. The island lies right across from Khabarovsk, the second largest city in the region, with a population of over 600,000. If China were to fully control the island, Khabarovsk would suddenly be a stone's throw from Chinese territory. Easy pickings if things get ugly. This isn't just a hypothetical nightmare for Russia. We've seen this play before. Just like with St. Petersburg during World War II, when Russia forcibly seized Finnish land to push its borders further from the city, Moscow will do whatever it takes to protect its so-called national interests. Outer Manchuria and these contested islands, they're no exception. Russia knows the stakes, but the game is slipping out of its hands. On paper, the dispute over Bolshoi Uralski was resolved by the 2004 treaty, which gave China half the island and access to key shipping routes along the Amur and Azori rivers. But as we know, China isn't one to settle for half. Sure, they got more than they bargained for without firing a shot, but Xi Jinping isn't done. Far from it. Xi is clinging to old grudges, and Russia's current weakness might be the perfect time to act. What Russia thought was a closed chapter could be blown wide open, and the island dispute is just one small part of a bigger picture. China's territorial ambitions don't stop with Bolshoi Uralski. The 2004 treaty might have given China half the island and some shipping rights, but it's clear that wasn't enough. In 2023, China published maps labeling the entire island as its own, signaling that Xi Jinping still has unfinished business. But that's not all. China also renamed key cities in Outer Manchuria, further stoking tensions. For Russia, this is more than political posturing, it's a warning. The same territory disputes that sparked conflict in the late 1960s could come back to haunt them, and China's eyes are now set on something far larger: Siberia and the Russian Far East. These resource-rich regions are becoming increasingly attractive to a China desperate for natural resources, and with a population 10 times larger than Russia's, China is better positioned than ever to make a move. One major prize? Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake by volume. With China's groundwater supply becoming increasingly undrinkable, the demand for fresh water is skyrocketing. Throughout the 2010s, Chinese companies tried to secure land around the lake to build pipelines that would pump water into China's densely populated regions. Though local protests forced Russia to shut these projects down, China's thirst for resources isn't going away. With 90% of its groundwater undrinkable, China now needs new sources, and Russia's remote, untapped territories are the perfect target. The stakes are high for both countries. Russia's struggling economy and shrinking population have left vast parts of its territory vulnerable, while China's growing need for natural resources is driving its ambitions. And Beijing, getting Russia out of Ukraine is just the first step in a larger game. With the war being waged for over 2.5 years now, it's become clear that Russia's main attributes are aggressiveness and flagrant disregard for human life, both military and civilian, Russian and Ukrainian. This presents a huge issue for China, particularly due to its forward-thinking attempts to create a second axis of power and influence that would rival the US. And to create that axis, China will need more resources, which plays into one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a near-global project for China to expand its sphere of influence via roadways, cargo routes, and train tracks. Dubbed the New Silk Road, the goal of the project is to directly connect China with countries across the Himalayas, including the lucrative Middle East. Why? Oil and gas. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq are all among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of oil deposits and production. However, the only current oil trade between the Middle East and China is conducted via ships, which need to pass through the Indian Ocean and the Strait of Malacca. The strait in particular is one of China's sore spots, pretty much since every ship going from China to the west passes through it. And the strait is managed by Singapore, which is in turn allied with the US, with the latter having several military bases located near the strait. This presents a significant security and economic issue to China. If China wants to act on its long-term goal of trying to invade or occupy Taiwan, it needs to go directly against the US in that hypothetical scenario. The US, alongside other members of the Quad security dialogue, Australia, Japan, and India, would likely create an impenetrable barrier surrounding the Strait of Malacca, preventing Chinese trade ships from entering the Indian Ocean. With China dependent on naval trade routes, trying to import resources in this manner would be tantamount to political and economic suicide for a country so lacking in natural resources. And that's where the BRI comes in. By creating additional routes through which China can obtain its resources, it reduces the reliance it has on the Strait of Malacca for conducting trade and obtaining capital. Furthermore, the BRI initiative reaches far beyond the Middle East. As many as 145 countries have expressed interest in being a part of the project, many of which are developing nations in Africa and South America. Thus, the BRI can also help China carve more influence in the world and make itself a lucrative option for trade and geopolitical relationships. That being said, the BRI is nowhere near close to being complete. The project is estimated to cost as much as $10 trillion overall, and the first phases are only starting to appear in official planning documentation. Thus, China's primary goal as of now seems to be creating a stable overland connection to Pakistan. While not the BRI, this plan would be a significant victory for China, as it would allow trade to pass from China to Pakistan and then over into the Middle East, either via land or through the Arabian Sea. Either way, China can avoid both nations that have significant claims and influence in the Indian Ocean, those being the US and India itself. But what does Russia have to do with the BRI? Russia itself is just one of the targets for the initiative, helping China secure more resources from Siberia. But more importantly, with Russia and China being allies, Russia's actions directly reflect on China. With Russia playing the role of an eternal aggressor and China closely monitoring or even helping Russia by providing it with weapons and helping it skirt around Western sanctions, nations that might be interested in becoming a major trading partner with China might turn to the US instead. And that's why China is so adamant about Russia getting out of the war in Ukraine one way or another. The longer the war goes on, the more disruption Russia will cause to its alliance with China simply by degrading the latter's influence with the rest of the world. Additionally, the proposed BRI is already an expensive proposition, but the COVID pandemic severely hit the economies of the same developing nations that would be ideal candidates for China's investments. With their economies slowing down, many of the investments that China had planned have not panned out at all. Some nations have been put into debt, so subsequent investments would cripple their economy and make them more dependent on China as a result. While this might be a good thing for China overall, it sets a particularly bad precedent for how China conducts its business and helps create a different axis of influence. Another wrench in the global economy has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of grain. Russia, meanwhile, is one of the largest exporters of oil and petroleum products. The invasion has impacted both in this regard, temporarily halting Ukraine's ability to export through the Black Sea, while Western sanctions on Russia have made it unable to trade with other countries. That's left Russia needing to conduct its trade through China. While the bilateral trade agreement between the two countries reached a record high amount of $240 billion in goods in 2023, the trade throughout has started to slow in 2024, likely as a result of sanctions catching up to China. Furthermore, the US has started to threaten Chinese banks that still conduct business with Russia, forcing China to choose between backing the Russian economy or maintaining its influence across the world. So what's China's solution to this dilemma? It seems that Xi is trying to maintain an illusion of neutrality in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. However, this illusion quickly disappears when you realize how much China has been helping Russia, and on multiple fronts. When Russia was hit with sanctions by most of the Western world, it was only left with BRICS, the intergovernmental alliance consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Their continued inclusion is likely due to the fact it's still a possible major oil and gas exporter. It's highly probable that BRICS is being led by China on all accounts, and Russia only gets to play along since it's still a relatively big economy on par with some of the other members. Most of the BRICS members have been helping Russia skirt around the sanctions by importing goods from other countries, relabeling them, and then sending them to Russia. Out of all the BRICS countries, China by far has the most influence and impact on the Russian economy. With Russia practically banned from using the US dollar, the countries have turned to the yuan and ruble to conduct bilateral trade. This hasn't slowed Russia's economy as much as the Western world would have hoped when the sanctions first hit. Additionally, while China has been peddling the idea that it doesn't directly support Russia's advances in Ukraine, the reality is quite different. Since Russia doesn't actually produce most of the high-tech parts that go into modern weapons and vehicles, it turns out China was the country's biggest supplier all along. China has also been using its immense industrial capacity to manufacture parts for the Russian war machine. The BBC estimates that 70% of all machine parts and 90% of all electronics and microchips that end up in Russia come either directly from or through China. All of these factors make it clear that while China and Russia have a strong alliance, it's actually more tenuous and uneven than it looks. For all the support China has been providing to Russia over the 30 months of war, Russia hasn't managed to make any significant progress in pushing further into Ukraine. Throughout the entire 2024, in fact, Russia has occupied roughly 600 square miles of territory. On the other hand, Ukraine has managed to achieve pretty much the same level of control of the Russian region of Kursk within a few weeks. With Russia unwilling to back down from its current war efforts, it turned to China for support, and China's plan for Russia to get out of the war is pretty bold. China's proposal for the so-called peace agreement is to simply proclaim the current situation as the status quo. China would like to see Russian sanctions dropped, which would allow it to trade more openly with China, thus further entrenching its influence in Russia, all fighting to stop, and the current territory that Russia occupied remains under tentative Russian control. The statements that China has issued are also controversial because China still maintains that it's a neutral country in the conflict, despite overwhelming evidence that it supports Russia. Their peace agreement plan would essentially help Russia win the war. But regardless of what China's statements actually are, the intent is clear. It wants Russia to get out of Ukraine, even if that means redrawing the Ukrainian borders. Otherwise, China may see its alliance with Russia degrade heavily in the coming months. If the Western threats of sanctioning Chinese banks become reality, it could mean a big hit for the Chinese income from trade with Russia. Additionally, the increasing NATO support for Ukraine means that Ukraine has been receiving more and more modern weaponry. NATO's chief officers believe that it might be time to give the green light to Ukraine to let them use the long-range missiles donated to them to strike deeper into Russia. This could potentially turn the tide of the war itself. If Moscow gets directly attacked, Putin might lose all of his leverage within the country and public support. Why does this matter? Well, as we established previously, both China and Russia haven't had a change in leadership in over a decade. If the war in Ukraine starts going sideways for Russia, there might be a scenario where Putin is forced to leave his post as the president, or worse, gets forcibly deposed in a revolution. Should that happen, there's no telling whether the next head of the Russian state maintains such close ties with China. If there's enough pressure from the West, the new government might turn 180 degrees towards the US, completely changing the geopolitical situation, not only for China, but perhaps for the world as a whole. And China doesn't want that to happen under any circumstance. That's why Xi is adamant about wanting the war to end as soon as possible. Seeing as Russia doesn't have any plans of relenting in its advance in Ukraine, its only option is to make bold proposals that might hopefully sway the world leaders into accepting the outrageous terms. But if that doesn't happen, and it probably won't, what's going to happen to the Russia-China alliance? Truthfully, probably not much, at least for a few years. As of now, China is still relatively happy with how its economy is growing and how much influence it can garner from other countries. So long as their BRI plans don't stray too far off course, countries would likely turn to China out of necessity, putting them right where China wants them. As for Russia, it might not be the biggest benefactor of China's economy for long. If the banks stop working with Russia, its economy might spiral out of control. This would turn its partial dependence on China into a full one, effectively allowing Xi Jinping to control the Kremlin's war and geopolitical rhetoric. If China closes the valve of money and weapon parts coming into Russia, the latter might be forced to submit. But that would put China in a bind, as it would need to publicly announce that it's stopping the already illegal skirting of sanctions. This could cause it to lose popularity with the BRI nations. Effectively, the problem between China and Russia is circular in nature. Both countries need one another, but Russia won't listen to China's demands, and China doesn't have enough influence to force other countries to do the same. On paper, this caustic combination should have caused the alliance to dissipate, but China is also using Russia as a scapegoat and leverage to garner support from other countries that are not as friendly to the US. In China's mind, perhaps truthfully, if they were to leave Russia to be the sole enemy of NATO, there might be no telling how BRICS countries would split their allegiances. While the alliance is informal in nature, its members have shown that they can support Russia in its ongoing war effort, which they may continue to do without China leading the pack. With many of the members taking a wait-and-see approach to the war in Ukraine and how it affects global geopolitics and economy, China is practically forced to do the same. Despite all of that, China still has one final trick up its sleeve through its border dispute with Russia. If Putin doesn't relent in his ongoing war effort, China might just decide to act on this. It would practically force Russia to choose between invading Ukraine and keeping its Far East secure. This would be one way to get Russia out of the current war, albeit by forcing them into the next one. Only this time, China wouldn't be helping Russia at all. Considering how inept the Russian military has proven to be at invading Ukraine, China could very likely succeed at occupying Outer Manchuria without significant difficulty and reinforce its previous claims on the region. But it's also possible that China will go a step further and move deeper into Siberia to get the true bounty of the land: access to Russian natural resources. Without Russia being the go-between for trade, China's industry will be poised to reach new heights, with free access to more minerals, timber, oil, and water. Of course, in this scenario, there are two factors that make life difficult for China. First, the US is already mounting pressure on China with regard to Taiwan and reinforcing its stranglehold on the Strait of Malacca. If China makes an offensive move, the US might follow. This could plunge the world into a new world war, with alliances quickly coming undone between countries that support the US and NATO, with Russia and China each playing their part. Secondly, Russia is virtually tied with the US for the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, with about 1,700 nukes each ready to go at the push of a few buttons. China also has a nuclear weapons supply of 500 warheads, but only about 24 of them are ready to go, and even those are in uncertain condition. With Russia's nuclear deterrence policy being that it justifies the use of nuclear weapons should another country with access to nukes attack them, Putin might just press the mutually assured destruction button. But with a concentrated attack on China, Russia wouldn't even need to use most of its nuclear bombs, just enough to replicate the attack on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. It would set the Chinese economy and industry basically back to where it was at its beginnings as a communist country. So China must plan things carefully. Its only feasible option is to repeatedly warn Russia to get out of the war with Ukraine before it's too late, but it also can't sever ties with the country as the BRI isn't nearly ready yet. Thus, the alliance between Russia and China will stay strong on paper, but both sides will start making contingency plans that will need to be adapted depending on how the war effort is going. But what do you think? Will China force the issue on Russia to get out of the war? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching. Now go and check out why Russia and China will be at war by this year, or click this other video instead.